Welcome back, Wanderer, to another episode of the Corner of Story and Game. Today, we wander back into the twilight realms of imagination and storytelling, guided by the insightful mind of Katelynn Kenney. Katelynn provides a wealth of experience from the world of theater, game running, and narrative design. And today, our quest takes us into the art of world building, where we examine 4 more of the lenses from Jesse Schell's The Art of Game Design. We will be looking at the lens of fantasy, the lens of world, the lens of avatar, and the lens of atmosphere. With Katelynn's background and expertise, we will seek to uncover the secrets of crafting immersive and captivating game worlds. So, Katelynn, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Gerald. It's a pleasure being here.
I am excited. You are another alum of the narrative department and someone who has become a friend and someone I actually got to play a little bit of Blades in the Dark kind of ish for 30 minutes once. That was kind of a fun experience. So we got a little bond going on there. But today we're here to talk about lenses, where I'm working my way through the lens of The Art of Game Design, the lenses by Jesse Schell. And today we are going to tackle the lens of fantasy, the lens of world, the lens of avatar, and the lens of atmosphere. And these 4 kind of work together about world building, which I know is you are as much a world building addict as I am. So this should be fun. We should start a club, World Builders Anonymous or something.
Yes. Help us, please.
Yeah, right. Give us more stuff to build and more tools. I don't want to be cured.
No.
But before we dive into the lenses, I would like to just get to know you a little better. Why don't you tell us your origin story? How did you fall in love with writing and gaming? When did you start gaming? How did you progress through childhood, education, career-wise? How did you get from there to here kind of thing?
Oh, yeah. What an epic. Yeah. I feel like it's a tale as old as time. As a kid, I definitely played games when I was younger. I think our first console was a PlayStation 1. We didn't have a Nintendo 64. Friends did. So we would always go over to our friend's house and we would play Smash Brothers quite a bit. And a lot of Pokemon, specifically the mini games. But those were a lot of our group video game experiences when I was younger until we got the PlayStation. And then Crash Bandicoot was one of my first games on that, which was a delight. But I think more than that, and which feels more in line with my TTRPG experience, just a lot of make-believe. I was kind of the eldest kid of the group a lot of the time, and usually a group of boys who were younger than me. So I would kind of Peter Pan them around, and we would create different adventures and work within a world, usually ones that were established, but we wanted to throw ourselves in and play around in there. So we did a lot of that. I did a lot of I think we tried to do Harry Potter once, or a couple times with a group. And I played Professor Snape, and I made one of the other kids cry, was how invested I got in.
Well done.
Thank you. So that's always been a part of my life, I guess. Writing-wise, my mom likes to say she knew I was going to be a writer, right away. I used to write a bunch of little stories and things and books through elementary school and middle school. And then my mom told me that, and then I decided I would not write, and I would be an actor. And so in high school, I shifted into, there was a drama club, and so I started acting for the first time, and that's when I started to discover theater, which is a great love of mine. And yeah, I completely pivoted away from writing. I ended up for undergrad double majoring in English and theater because I felt like I had to have some kind of other thing, and English made sense at the time.
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I left undergrad with a really thorough theater education. It was a smaller program, so I got to do everything. I got to act, direct, stage manage, sound design, costume design. I did not do any lighting design, which I regret, but it was a grand time, and I learned a lot about world building via the stage in that way. And then that was in South Dakota. I bopped around a lot as a military kid, and then went to New York after that to pursue theater as an actor and a director. And I think about 2 to 3 months in, realized I hated auditioning, and that when I was sitting in these audition rooms, I was doing it wrong, by the way. So if you're out there acting in New York, and you're auditioning and you're doing it right, it'll probably be fine. But if you're going non-union to equity calls and sitting hoping to be seen at the very end of the day, not the best way to do it unless you want to become a writer. Because during that time of waiting, I would be writing. I ended up writing my first full-length play and then pivoting. So I started pivoting into playwriting, and then basically my life is a series of pivots. As I continued in my playwriting venture, my plays started getting weirder and weirder. I went to a grad school called Brooklyn College. Their MFA program is known for weird theater. And I was like, great, I want to break open and like do that. And I did. I made some funky plays you perform by yourself at home, plays that are part like audio track that you get delivered in a box. Just a play that's like all around a campfire, kind of like epic style, like epic narrative style telling. And then some pieces with like a lot of different kinds of audience engagement. And I started thinking a lot about audience agency. Now, mind you, on the gaming track, after I left home, I didn't have a console in college. And so I kind of stopped playing games. I kind of fell off it for years and years and years. And then this started kind of percolating in my plays until I hit a point where I was like, can we give a theater audience full agency? And what does that look like? And chaos is the answer. It's an interesting experiment, and one that I hope to continue to pursue. But one of my friends was like, Katelynn, you seem so interested in audience engagement and having them fill like, kind of avatar roles and doing these kinds of things. Do you want to write for games? And I ended up getting connected and got my first a mobile game job in 2022. And that is a very long explanation of my journey.
That is so cool. I swear I say this in every episode, but I want to bring you back now and talk just about narrative structures in theater, in plays, and in that form, because that's also very cool. But today's about the lenses. I'm also curious, have you seen or have you been to a improv D&D show?
I have not yet. Actually, I had several people who work at the game shop that I work at in Brooklyn, and then a friend auditioned for 20-Sided Tavern, I think, is one of the new shows that's starting here. I think it had runs in other places like Chicago. But yeah, it's supposed to be a big one, and they just finished casting that, and it's going up or is up now. So I've been hoping to check that out.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. It'll be right up your alley with the whole allowing the audience agency, but only so much, and it's really cool. Very, 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 very cool.
Did you get to roll a giant die?
Some of them do. I've never got to do it, but I don't think I've been to one where there was there, but I've heard about them. Yeah. There's one done up here in Edmonton that Mark Muir and others do that's so cool. So, and they just announced dates for this year, so I can't wait to go.
Yeah, I suppose I did a version with our shop. We picked four DMs who work at this game shop that I'm at, and we did a kind of like in the park experience this one time for kids. So we invited these kids out. We had a big inflatable die, and then we had our DM, and then we had the other three of us were, I think, a barbarian. I was like a wizard and a rogue. And so then the kids like helped us roll the die. We went on an adventure, defeated some goblins, etc., etc.
That's so cool.
He's cute.
All right. Well, let's wander back to what we're here to focus on, the lenses.
Yes.
So we're going to start with the lens of fantasy. This one's pretty broad, pretty general. Talking about applying the viewpoint of fantasy and fantastical elements in your game, in your design. So to start broad, let's tap into that theater and game writing experience. How have you seen this lens, the fantasy elements infused into narratives to begin, just to start dialing us in?
The fantasy elements like infused into narratives. I feel like this is like such a broad thing, right? When I think of story stack, I mean, like fantasy is the overarching thing of it all. I mean, the fantasy it affects everything. Whatever you're choosing for that will essentially create all the constraints. I've been dealing with a lot of constraints lately, and so within that, but that I think is the exciting part. So where I start with fantasy and narrative, usually it depends on the piece, and it depends on like the first gem of the idea. If I'm coming from like original pieces, sometimes like my plays will start, for example, with a kind of thought experiment. Oh, what if I did a rom-com that was in a post-apocalypse where a living survivor fell in love with a ghost and skull? And then I just go, oh, that's interesting. And then I try to ask all the questions I can ask about that and find the further threads that are intriguing to me. And I kind of just pull myself along. And I think starting with that image or that question or that thought, and then allowing yourself that ability to expand and see where this can go, the extent of it, that's part of the fantastical elements for me, is like, how can I draw that out for myself? How can I make it even more of the thing that was the original thought? Anyway, I don't know if that's too grounded, but yeah.
I like that. And it's not just, just looking at the lens, you're talking about your process, how your personal craft technique, which I find fascinating. Everybody's got different ways of doing things. We can assume something is like, this is how we all do it because it's how I do it. But talking to other people, you quickly find out that everybody's got a slightly different way. And I love that. That's very cool. To pull it into the sub-theme of world building, can you think of an example, either something you've done personally in game writing or in theater, or something you've seen in a game or in a play where this lens was applied exceedingly well to the world building? So the lens of fantasy as it applies to creating lore or background or characters that are in the setting or whatever it is as part of that world building process.
Oh, yeah. Well, just because it's on top of mind, I've been watching it. So I'm bad gamer, good TV person. I'm watching Fallout right now on Prime, but I have not played Fallout yet. And now I'm a type of person who, if I know something is being adapted, I tend to like to do the adaptation first and then go back to the source material, because I like to try to like them both. And so I want to give the adaptation a chance and start with that. So normally I do that with like books and movies when that happens. That actually, Watchmen, that was my experience with Watchmen. I watched the movie first and was like, this is so cool. And then I read the graphic novel. Anyway, all this to say, I'm thinking about Fallout and the world building done in that. We haven't finished the show. I've just seen the first, I think, 4 or 5 episodes. And I mean, like, I feel like the fantasy is fully leading, like, with that. The idea of, okay, the 50s, the bombs all drop. What is the wild world that can expand and bloom from this place? And what are all the strange little, like, tacks we can take? And so I'm finding I'm, like, kind of obsessing over all these little world elements. I don't know if it's going to happen. I don't know how big a part it played in the game. But just the mention of these cockroaches, like, becoming larger and potting up, like, I'm like, when are we going to get into a cockroach den? Like, when are we going to, that's where my brain goes. But every little aspect of that, I'm wanting to know more about this. And I think that's what good world building does, is it makes a person entering that world want to know more about every little detail. And you do that by giving specific details. Every time you can drop something that feels specific and lived in, someone's going to go, oh, I want to live in that. So anyway, I'm experiencing that with Fallout, the TV show right now. So I'm very excited to go and play the games. Oh,
you have to let me know when you do, so I want to share your experience, because I came in it the other way. I love that the Fallout world, like you said, it's like the 50s when the bomb drops, but it's not our 50s. Like, if you go back, it's the 50s with a like slightly different tech and a slightly different aesthetic, and it's really cool. And then the bomb drops and everything mutates, and I won't ruin anything for you. So yeah, you need to finish the show and then go play the game. So you can look up online which ones you should play in chronological order as opposed to the order they came out in. If you want to do it that way, it's kind of cool.
What is that? What you recommend? Chronological?
It depends on whether you want to experience the games in a like historical, this is how other gamers experienced it, and this is kind of the experience that we all had, or if you want to play them, this is the storyline of like, it's like if you tell somebody to watch Star Wars, do you tell them to watch 3, 4, 5 and then go back, watch 1, 2, 3, or do you watch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like if they've never seen them before?
Okay, but what do you do? Do you tell them 3, 4, 5?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would.
Okay, all right. Okay, then I feel like I should experience it as it released.
Yeah, you probably should. Yeah, you should. Yep. Okay. So yeah, that's the lens of fantasy. Fantastical elements, pulling people in. I love your technique. That's very cool. That's an excellent way of applying the lens. A plus.
Woo!
So that moves us along to the lens of the world. So world building. This one's again a big picture one, a very broad and general one. I guess in the vast tapestry, I love that big word, world building. How do you balance when you're approaching something so big? How do you balance the need for depth and like lots of detail, like you were talking about, things pulling people in, and still maintaining coherence and relevance? And like, it's a problem we run into when we're, as DMs, building our homebrew worlds. It's like, I want to go super deep on everything, but then suddenly you got lots of things to track, and it's not, you're going to have stuff you're never going to use for 15 years. And so how do you find that balance?
I think it's grounded in the narrative. I think the narrative is kind of your critical path, your guiding light. And from there, the world around it is what will enhance that. Like the world around it, all the details you pull are things to pull out different threads in the story. And there can be worlds that are so vast they can contain multitudes of stories. And so you can build with that. But I feel like that's always a framework for me personally, is when I feel like I'm getting too broad with my world, or I'm getting too like ultra specific with a detail, I have to remind myself, like, how does this relate to the narrative? Or in games, how is this relating specifically to the narrative for the player and their experience? And if it's not connected, or it's not connected enough, I either need to find a way to further integrate it, or I need to let it lie for another story. And sometimes I think that's something you've got to get used to as you write more and more, is when you have learning the skill of knowing when to let go of an idea for now and going, it's not for this project, it's not for this thing. I'll come back to it this next time and I'll build a story around it. And then that'll do it justice. So yeah, I think I just go back to the narrative and go back to the player and their experience and just check in with that.
Makes total sense. Oh. That's a hard lesson to learn, when to let go. I mean, I went to art school. Learning when the last brushstroke is done on a painting is one of the hardest things you can possibly learn. I'm curious, because I like to ask this question sometimes of my artist friends, is, do you remember when you learned that lesson? Do you remember the project or the thing you were working on where you were like, okay, I need to let this go. This is where this one ends and I need to move on, whether it's done or... Let's be honest, we're artists. It's never done. But this is when was the first time you learned, hey, I got to cut it off here?
Yeah. I think I learned that maybe after between my first and second full-length plays. I think somewhere in there, I'd been working on my first full-length for a while. We did a workshop of the play, and I could have still done tinkering, but I think at that point I really needed to shift focus. And so I was like, I think I can leave it for now. Like, that was kind of just giving myself the permission of like, I can always come back to it. And I feel like plays in particular are something you can really do that with, because I mean, there are so many, I would say the majority of plays that are written are not necessarily published. So they're not locked in. Like, so many plays are, based on their productions and what's done of that, but then you have the original production, but the second, the third, the fourth production might all be different because the direction is different, the design is different, the script, you can change the script between all of these iterations. And so I think that gave me a little freedom for that. I think that feeling locked in when I heard other playwrights say similar things. I think Brennan Jacob Jenkins said something similar of like, a play's never really done. You just kind of like leave it for, whether it's for now or forever, you just kind of let it go.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Sorry, my kids just finished the Frozen Junior run at the theater, so Let It Go kind of triggered me for a second there.
Oh God. I did watch the second one of that semi-recently.
Yeah. I like them. They're good.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so yes, letting it go. Yeah. What about you?
The first time I finally was able to say, okay, I'm done with this. Mm-hmm. Probably the first novel manuscript, I had to finally just say, okay, I'm done tinkering with this and I need to move on. So early 20s.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I used to draw a lot as a kid. I did a lot of comic book art. I wanted to be Frank Miller at one point, and I was always really good with that, about just draw it, erase it, draw it, erase it. Okay, time to move on. But that first novel manuscript was really hard to put into the drawer and just let it go.
We got to think of another Frozen song to...
Into the Unknown, I said.
Yes.
Yeah. Or a musical theater family. I can keep going. Okay. But again, theater, I do want to bring you back to talk about theater and plays at some point. But I'm curious, I'm going to riff off this for a second. Using the lens of the world in application to creating plays, theater, musical theater, for instance, the world of Arendelle and Frozen, how do you think the lens of the world, as we understand it for game writing and game design, is it applicable to like a theater developing a play?
Yes, so much so. Actually, I think I'm going to drop this during our class and stuff, but it's one of my favorite essays. It is by Eleanor Fuchs, and it's EF's Visit to a Small Planet, Some Questions to Ask a Play. And it is a full dip into what is the world of this play. I think the interesting thing that remarks upon, which separates plays from many other writing mediums, is that the world of a play is crafted in language. So much of the visual experience often is theater of the mind, and is, we might have some set pieces, we might have some effects, but you're not going to feel like you're fully in Arendelle when you're watching Frozen on stage, et cetera, et cetera. But we fill that in because of all of the other elements that come into it. But language is the largest, the most powerful tool in a playwright's arsenal. And so that goes into that, but then it also asks so many questions that go beyond, I think, what sometimes playwrights will think of. What are some of the questions? It has one of my favorite quotes ever, which I'm gonna say, because is the world of the play at the end of the play a transformed world, or is it the same world returned to normal with minor adjustments? Worlds stand or fall on your answer. And so this essay is filled with juicy quotes like that. And I think world building for plays, and really just world building for everything, is just a series of questions. What is the climate of this place? What does that mean if it's arid? What does it mean if it's, how is time marked here? What does that mean? And just going and going and going. And that's where you can get lost in it, right? As a fellow world builder, as you're continuing the chain of questions. When you're trying to communicate that in play versus game, in a game, you can environmentally storytell, and the player can move about the world and experience it that way. In a play, your audience, for the most part, doesn't have to be, for the playwrights out there who are like traditional theater only, you can go beyond. You've got your audience sitting and watching this thing. And so how do you get them to feel the climate of the space? How do you get them to feel the political atmosphere outside? Do you have chanting through the windows that come in every once in a while, cutting off the dialogue of the characters? Do you have them sweating and taking off their shirts because it's too hot? How are the ways you're communicating that in this very particular scene and moment that people are just locked into and watching? So I think kind of goes back to the world building is constrained by the frame of the stage. And it's your job as the playwright to world build within that constraint.
I love that. You made me, I hadn't thought about it in a long time. I went to a presentation of a one-man Rime of the Ancient Mariner. A guy did it, and it was a stage. There was 80 people maybe there. An anchor in the center of the stage at an angle, single spotlight. He started at the anchor, walked around the audience the whole time talking, had a drink in one hand like an old ceramic tankard. He was stumbling. The whole thing was, there was no set, there was no special effects, there was no audio apart from his voice. And by the end, you had been there. You had seen the party, you had watched him on the ship, you had seen the albatross, but it was one guy, an anchor, and a drink. And that was it.
I think it goes back to just the power of, not to get to all our writer heads, but the power of narrative. words and story have the ability to fully transport you just with the words. And we like to, we have all these other additions that further enhance it. And those are incredible aspects too. But I think bare bones plays like that remind me that sometimes, like, you can do this with just the words alone. Yeah.
Powerful stuff.
It's cool.
I love it.
Cool. It's so
Goosebumps.
Cool.
All right. Let's move along, or we'll just keep doing this all day.
I know.
The lens of the avatar. So this one's pretty obvious, and we're obviously narrowed in considerably here. So in video games, the avatar, of course, is the character that the player gets to take control of. In role-playing games, it's your player character that you make, etc., etc. So to get us rolling into this, as a dungeon master, game runner, as you mentioned before, you run games at the game store you work at. How do you work with your players to ensure that they have both the space and the agency inside of the game and inside of the narrative to develop the avatar that they desire to play?
This is where I love a session zero. I love it, so much. Because I think, I think it's so helpful for everyone to be developing their characters together. Certainly, secrets are fun, and secrets are things we can have. Secrets from, other players, and secrets from the DM even, or etc. But I think there's a kind of tone element that you want to set all together. There's a, almost like filling of the narratives. I think actually Jesse Schell gets into this right after the lens of Avatar box in it, but essentially like going the breakdown of what roles are these people filling. And oftentimes in like D&D 5e, we think of the classes. Like, do we have a healer? Do we have a so-and-so? Do we have a spellcaster? And I think that's a level of that. But I think at a session zero where you can really dig into it, you can go a level deeper. Like, who is the person who is the kind of, we got to get the job done person? Who is the person who is the chaos ball who's going to so on and so forth? Who is the person who, is the curious one who has to explore every nook and cranny? And I think in doing that, you really allow the narrative to expand in many different ways, as opposed to doing it separately when suddenly you have a table of, 5 chaos balls. And then you're like, okay, how do I frame the narrative around these 5?
Yeah.
So I think through a session zero, you can find those complements. And through that too, the DM also knows what is important to the player, to each of the players for their story, and can start mapping, where am I going to roll out, each of these things? What's important to these people? Where do they conflict on what could be important, and what are those conflicts that I can throw at them and then make them, have to deal with that? And I think a lot of the time we think that's just combat, or, that can be the easy thing to slip into. I'll throw them this challenge, this puzzle, this thing. But at a session zero where you can get at where people's player characters' values lie, you can throw conflicts that are more political in nature or more moral in nature, and have them, role-playing with each other in a deeper way. So anyway, long answer to that.
No, that's the short answer. I 100% agree. I'm lucky. Both of my core groups I played with for the newer one has been like 15 years now. And the other one I've played with for 30 some years, a long time. So I know everybody. Like, I could run a game tomorrow from scratch, knowing what they want. But even then, a session zero, because you can pull out, okay, this time I want to try this, or I want to do that. So it's important to know that. And it's also very important to keep in mind that not everybody wants to play a complex, narratively driven, twisty-turny story. Some people just want a tank, DPS, and healer. Like, some people are fine with the WoW standard and they want to sit down and just play that, and that's cool. That's a game too. That's a good time. So, yeah. You mentioned secrets. One I'm well known for is I will get my players to allow me to make a part of their backgrounds. So they'll be like, okay, here's my character and here's everything about it, except for I don't know what happened to my dad, or I don't know where I got this magical sword from. And then I will use that to create plot twists that will completely mess with their heads, which is a lot of fun. But we all have a good time. So yeah, but you've got to establish that trust. You got to sit down, especially with a new group. You don't know the people, sit down, get to know each other, and just establish, even on paper, okay, here's what we're going to do and here's what we're all into, until you get to know each other really well. But
Yeah.
I am totally on board.
Oh, I love that. I love that. No secret dolings out of secrets. That's so fun.
There's things in the world, because I've used the same game world for, oh my God, 36 years now. So it's got a lot of stuff in it. And there are secrets in there that from 3 campaigns ago, 12 years ago, that they just found out 2 weeks ago. And when they have that moment where they stop and go, wait, is this the thing from, and then their heads explode. So yeah, that's worth the payoff. It's a lot of work, but it's worth the payoff.
Yeah, those are really amazing moments. And I feel like they're, you can have really cool story moments like that in a play and in, TV and other mediums that you're like more passive than active. But in a game, whether you're, playing it on a video game or you're at a table with people and discovering in the moment, there's that just visceral reaction of, whoa, like this is happening to me. And I'm completely thrown off. I had a kind of moment with that with my Baldur's Gate 3 Dirge run that I'm on right now. So, yes.
I like the callback moments too. When a player does something, a year ago, and then it comes back to bite them in the ass. I love those moments.
I think consequences are like just really critical, truly. I think having those consequences, and I think delayed consequences are just so fun because I think they're done a little less often. Anyway.
Totally. The lens of Avatar, though, to dial us back in and here. So when a player has an avatar in a game, they want to feel connected to that in some way, whether it's just a face in a first-person shooter or it's in a tabletop role-playing game where they've been playing for years. So I'm curious, what techniques have you used or seen that allow for stronger connection between a player and the avatar?
So, I mean, I think paired with what I just said, in a session 0, I think that's a great place to start that connection. I think players will grow into the connection too. Just naturally as they play, they'll start to fall into, with each choice they make, they're like crafting the character more and more and more. And the character is, either solidifying in certain ways or changing in other ways. I think so. At the top, a strong session 0 is a great way to start that establishment. I think as the game continues, like a game master pulling in more of those connections that connect to the kind of narrative core of the player. In D&D, this is a little harder. The mechanics aren't really built around narrative growth and like character growth in that way. But I think about Avatar Legends RPG, which is based on the Powered by the Apocalypse system. And that one really digs into those kinds of things of thinking about like, what are the characters, primary two kinds of like competing and complementary qualities, and what happens when they lean too far one way or another. And so that's something that I've been thinking about more for my games, is how can I, kind of be more point blank about what my character values, who they feel they are, and then pushing against that with something like a direct challenge to that, or complementing it and allowing that to pull out. And then how does that change the group dynamics? So I think having those explicit conversations with your players is really helpful in that regard. And then just dropping those in and further crafting the character as you go. The BG3 experience that I was talking about was a moment where I felt like a strong connection happened. Like basically that seal of player and player character, like smacked together in a single moment. And I think that for me particularly was done because I am a certain kind of role player. I think I tend to go in the good sphere to neutral sphere. And I was kind of planning this with my character on this dirge run. I was like, I'm going to go the whole redemptive or, resisting the dirge. And so Baldur's Gate 3 did a really cool thing where it kind of surprises you with some of these moments that happen. And in that moment, that happens in Act 1. I won't say any more spoilers about it. I legitimately felt one with the character and the character's shock and surprise upon, this incident. And it was just so powerful because we felt like so completely aligned. So anyway, so that is an example, I feel like, of experiencing that connection when you can, as the writer, think about how your player might be feeling in this moment and how it could be very closely or even aligned exactly with your player character, and then delivering on the, like, whatever that blow is to finally connect them. So that really did it for me.
That kind of takes me back to that conversation we had in the narrative classes we took about ensuring that the desires or what the avatar wants and what the player wants line up. Maybe not perfectly, but if the avatar wants to go and kill the gods in order to put their memories to rest, and you kill the gods because it's fun gameplay, at least your goals are aligned and you can feel connection. Is that part of what happened there, you figure?
Yeah, so I think that's a level of what happened. And I think that's how I started really slipping into the character more. I think that moment in particular was one where I nearly felt like I was experiencing the exact same feeling. Like, I know I didn't do the action, but because of the craftiness of the writing, your player character doesn't necessarily know that you did the action per se. And so there's a full alignment in that moment. So it's like you were saying, where you and the character are aligned in your goals, but separate in your motivations. But then in that moment, I felt like a complete, I keep slapping my hand. I know it's like, this is a podcast. I don't know. Can you hear this sound? Slapping my hands together. But anyway, yeah. So I definitely think that was in play there. And I think that was like a moment of pure merging for me personally. I think those moments happen, but it's also interesting to get the kind of flip on those moments. I was playing D&D as a player in one of these campaigns that I've had that have been, it's like 3 years in, I think. And my character has played through Rime of the Frostmaiden, for anyone familiar with that adventure in D&D 5e. And my character developed this kind of madness and that essentially makes her kind of bloodlusty. She wants to kill everything now. And she's not that kind of character. And so this is like kind of shifting her in a lot of ways. But I was experiencing a lot of the opposite, where I'm trying to role play this bloodlust that my character now has. But I personally am like, I would much rather try to talk to this, this person than try to kill them. But here I am having to do that. And that's like a really interesting texture too. So I've been thinking a lot about that when you like misalign your character and the player, and like what that tension feels like when you come back in. I have this like grand idea, Gerald. Also, get me back on track when you need to, of this other game where I'm like, as the player, and someone can run away with this because I don't know that I'll ever get to it, but essentially the idea comes down to the player is playing this player character. You're moving your avatar around, you're doing things. You kind of have a relationship with them where it's almost like patron to, a warlock in essence, or it feels kind of like that. But then partway through the game, that avatar that you are playing starts doing its own thing. Like you cannot, the controls are going off and you are not able to control it. I feel like that's a moment where the player can feel like this patron who's suddenly losing control of the warlock in essence. And then that person that that was your avatar becomes an NPC in the game. And basically you have to create a new avatar that is yourself. And then you might face off, might join sides, etc. But anyway, I'm trying to think of how we can align those feelings and also create tension and frustration within the player that's purposeful for like a flip like that. Anyway.
That's very cool. That would be so cool if you were like the first to act, you were to build up the strong connection between the player and the avatar. So it feels like, okay, this game, I am this person. And then that moment happens really fast and it's like you're kicked out of that body. That would be so cool.
Right. And you're like, wow. Like I imagine the first moment of not being able to control, like you're trying to move forward and you're like, why is my character not? And then break.
have the avatar turn to the fourth wall.
Exactly.
That would be what? That's so cool.
Oh, so good.
Make a good horror movie. Like he turns in as like a monster. Anyways, yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
Before we move on to the last lens, just for a second, there was something bouncing in my head there. The tabletop role-playing games, and this is something I've kind of bumped my head into. So it's an opportunity to pick up somebody's brain on this. If you have friends who are like into they enjoy stories, they enjoy being part of stories and playing stories and reading stories and watching stories, but they're not trained in narrative craft. They have never really wandered down that really deep rabbit hole. Have you ever taken them aside and said, okay, well, here, I know you want to do this. Here is a traditional structure, whichever one of the structures you want to use, and here's what a plant is for, and here's what a twist is for, and we can build you a narrative structure for you. And do you ever take a tabletop role-playing game and turn it into something that's a little more theatrical or a little more literature? I'm just, again, curious, totally wandering off the track here.
No, I love that. I haven't gone that direct with it before, but I've definitely thought about it, and I'm like open to that kind of thing. Like particularly, I guess the closest thing that I'm kind of experiencing that, or like a version of that in this moment, my DM has come to me in this campaign that I just mentioned, where I'm playing this warlock who has this bloodlust now, and basically came and was like, hey, she's kind of been going down this darker path. Is that something that you're really wanting to kind of build into for this kind of like last leg of our adventure? And I'm like, I could be. I think, with permissions from the other players, that we're all good with this kind of darker route. And the DM was basically like, I'm thinking of having you kind of team up with, the big bad essentially, or have like a flip in this moment. And I was like, I'm down for that. My sad warlock was built poorly, so she's not going to be big bad material. But if you give her some, cool powers and stuff, I'd be down to role play that. So that was, I feel like it's been the first moment where I've had a very explicit, like, we're doing this for the story, and we're going to like fully mold this moment rather than going into the improv and trying to like get there through the improv of the thing.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's attack the last lens, the lens of atmosphere. So this is kind of, in the world of world building, this is kind of the skin on top, the mist that envelops the hills, that last bit of flavor. So in your experience, or in your wandering through the world of games and theater, how do you think one leverages atmosphere as an element or as a lens to invoke specific emotions, enhance a player or the audience's experience of what they're partaking in?
I think of atmosphere a lot. I deal in the genres of, fantasy, horror, sci-fi a lot. And I feel like those deal heavily in atmosphere. And within each of those genres, there are all the subgenres of, whatever this thing is and how that like permeates the world. Is this a gritty sci-fi, or is it a, solar punk? Is it a, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if you're not starting from a place of like the world and the atmosphere starting, but you're starting with characters, then you might go from a place of what atmosphere can we pull in to enhance these characters and the stories that they're wanting to go on. I think that's a way to get specific emotions out of that, is to like essentially cater to that thing. If you have a world that has an established atmosphere and then you're putting characters into it, that's where I think you have to align. For example, if I'm doing like a kind of, one of my homebrewed worlds is essentially New York 1,000 years in the future, after the climate crisis has like ravaged things, and basically magic users have come back to Earth and like fix things up and taken over. And so with that, there is a certain kind of atmosphere of like magic over humanitech is what I call it, like human technology and things like that, kind of nature resurfacing. And so within that, what are the themes or the elements that like kind of echo out of that? And going, okay, so maybe I want a, human who is trying to connect deeper with nature. So you're like establishing some of those ties that already exist in the world and allowing that to to breathe. So I think whichever way you're coming from it, atmosphere can just enhance those things. I think tone, I think about tone a lot too, and like humor and like grit and how that plays into atmosphere too. And in D&D, there's an interesting thing where I feel like you can definitely tonally be specific about your campaign, but there's something about a game where there's going to be bits of weird fun, the random, cabbage man and this cabbage cabbages getting tossed off the ledge all the time, versus some of the heavier moments. And so that I think is interesting about at least D&D in particular, since that's mostly what I play, that it can kind of hold a lot of different tones and atmospheric elements. And it's kind of adjust, or at least in my experience, what I do in my campaign is like adjust it toward the specific mission that we're going on and the thing we're doing. When I think about that, like you can kind of see that in Baldur's Gate 3 too, in the way of like, Act 1 feels very different from Act 2, and the atmosphere you're establishing in both those places and the weight that they carry. Yeah. Anyway, long-winded.
No, that's perfect. Are there techniques you think that you can take from theater when it comes to building atmosphere in a story or a space that could be applicable to other areas like games?
Oh yeah, I think the biggest lesson from theater that can be taken to other mediums is how you can convey so much through the dialogue and through the way people speak to each other. And like so many, oftentimes you get asked as like, in playwriting, is like, what are the rules of the world? I feel like theater and games are so linked in so many different ways. But one of the ones I think about, which I did not think about before I'd been delving deeper into games, was the rules of the world idea and the different games that are played in plays. And those are all done with like language and sculpting. So like, for example, a game in language might be that, one of the characters keeps calling out to the different, to the sun and to the stars and to the moon or something. And this new character who's come into it is like, what's going on with this thing? And then starts calling to the sun and to the stars and to the moon. And we're establishing something about the world here. Maybe that there is a religious practice that, calls to these things to bring down this entity of whatever, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think you can do that with language too. If you're going like horror, thinking about the language and like even the scarcity or the longevity of language and the texture there in a horror, the less you say, the better probably, because you might be skulking and hiding from something. If you're getting a really, long-winded, wordy monologue about something, you might be setting the tone for, a place that has a more academic vibe or center, et cetera, something to that effect. So I think thinking about dialogue texture is a really helpful tool that can be pulled into more game writing to enhance atmosphere and world building.
That brings us to the end of the lenses. So before we start heading towards the door here, I do have a question that I like to ask everybody who comes on the show, and I'm sure you've probably heard it by now, but that question is, in my opinion, there exists this magical space at the intersection of obviously story and game, but also theater and musical theater and movies and playwrights and comic books and novels and all these things, where all these people can just get together, hang out. There's a shared language. There's a fellowship that just exists naturally. Now, if you agree with me, because not everybody does, but if you do, what is the magical thread that holds this space together?
Yeah, I was thinking on this one. I think we've talked about this in the narrative department, and specifically of writers being the kind of helm of this, which is maybe why I am saying it. But I think feeling, I think story in all of its forms, its deep power is that it can get us to feel things just from the hearing of it. In games, you even get to experience it and get you that much closer. But I think we gather for this because we want to feel these things. We want to experience you know, love, of family, of friends. We want to experience deep despair. We want to move through all these feelings. And story kind of gives us a safe place to explore all of those. And I think that's a really cool thing. I think it's kind of like humans' spell work in a way. Like if we were to have magic, I think crafting story and getting people to experience something that they would not otherwise have experienced is magic.
That's beautiful. There's a follow-up question that I don't always ask, but I do when I get the right answer to that question. And that follow-up question is, taking that into consideration, the power of stories and what it can do to a human being and can do to society in general, what burden does that put on us as modern-day story makers and storytellers?
I try not to think of it as a burden and more of a responsibility. And I think that's what it puts on us, is a responsibility, right? Mm-hmm. We are responsible for the stories that we tell. We are responsible for the feelings that we kind of inflict on other people through these stories, which requires care and thoughtfulness. Sometimes as writers, we can get ahead of ourselves with the ideas and the things. We don't necessarily think about, why are we coming to this story? Why are we telling this story? Why are we the ones telling this story? It's sometimes a big question to ask too. And I think that's the responsibility all writers hold and should note for themselves, are asking those questions of themselves and really getting to the bottom of it. Because sometimes those aren't questions we want to ask. We just want to do the fun thing and write the thing. We don't want to ask, should I be making this person feel this way? Should I be doing this kind of thing? How is this going to leave a person after they're done with it? I actually have an example of this, and I'm still kind of wrestling with it, with a play of mine, the box play. It is a play called Fable, A Cat Play in a Box, that is about, you play a character in which you adopt this cat, this very tiny cat, and in your 3 days of caring for the cat at the end passes away. And I did not prep them. I did put like content warnings and things like that they could access if they wanted to. But I didn't otherwise prep them and let everyone kind of move through the experience as they would. And then I had very mixed reactions at the end as far as how people felt when they moved through that experience. Some people were like, that was incredible to feel that kind of expansive feeling very quickly, and I wasn't expecting it. And then other people had a reaction that was like, I felt manipulated and like hurt. And so I think that those are the questions that writers have to ask themselves. You know, is that what you want them feeling at the end? That if it's not, then how do you adjust?
Important. Okay, well, that's the serious stuff. This is almost time to head out the door. Before we go, there is what I like to do, a little quick fire, just to get to know Katelynn just a little bit better. Quick, all top of the mind, just what are you playing right now?
Oh, I'm playing my gerald BG3 and Hades.
Oh, Hades.
Yes, for the first time. I'm coming at it late.
Phil will be happy to hear that.
I know.
What are you currently reading?
Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. So games are on the mind.
There you go. What do you listen to while you write?
Ooh, it depends on the piece. Usually I'll find a single song that I'll play over and over and over and over again. And if not, then the Spirited Away soundtrack.
Nice. That's a good one.
Yeah.
If you could host a game session with any 4 people, living or dead, from any time in history, who would you invite and what would you play?
Okay, this is so hard. And I was really thinking about, I'm just going to quick fire these, but I feel like there are too many. Anyway, Tolkien, Anne Washburn, Craig Mazin, and Susan O'Connor.
Oh, nice. That would be fun.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's the quick fires. Before we head out the door, I like to open a little space. Is there anything you're working on you'd like to promote? Is there anything you've done in the past you'd like to just point people to, just so they're aware?
Sure. Yeah. Let's see. Right now I just started working on 2 indie games. Double check to see if I can say much about. I had asked about it. Great. One of the games I'm working on right now is called Xerxes Shadow. And then the other game that I'm working on is called Wildermage, which is a free roaming AR adventure game. Yeah, I'm really excited about that. So I'm getting to mission stuff there, and it'll be grand. So wait for that. What else? Theater-wise, if you're in New York, I'm a part of the New George's Jam right now, and we've got our Jamboree, I believe, on May 12th. So you can swing on by for some weird stuff. I told you I did weird theater. This latest piece is a kind of experiment where we took, well, I don't want to spoil it for you if you're coming, but essentially we took a clip of something, tried to make it into a dance, and there are 3 versions spoken through of dance instructions that you do kind of silent disco style, so that you watch 3 people doing 3 different interpretations of something that is not a dance. Anyway, so yeah, you can check all those out, and you can find me most places at Kenney Plays, K Kenney Plays, and follow me there.
Perfect. All right, well, time to close up shop and head out the door. As we go, I would love to give you the final words. So any parting words of wisdom?
Ooh, words of wisdom, no. Words, yes. Mostly just to say that if you're a person like me who gets excited by multiple mediums, I say go for it. Explore each one. Take the skills you're learning from one and bring it to another. I did not think as many skills were transferable as they are between theater and game writing, but it turns out there are so many. And so I say that don't discount yourself if you're a kind of jack of all trades / finding your way through different mediums. Use those skills in the different worlds and bring a different flavor that might open up some new pathways, some new stories, new ways to approach narrative.
Well, the lights are down, the curtains are closed, and the ushers are going to start demanding overtime. So it's probably time to close up shop. First, a massive thank you to Katelynn for such a wonderful conversation. And to you, dear listener, as always, thank you for taking your seat at the table. Until we meet again, remember to keep exploring, creating, and sharing your stories with the world. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the Corner of Story and Game.